What is going on, guys? Welcome back. Ryan Moody, Jimmy Smith, our MMA show. And this is going to be probably a topic we cover a couple times, kind of an involved story, and as with most of these things, kind of an evolving story. So right now, what we do know is Jessica Penne is apparently the next in line to battle USADA. She's came out and asked fans to donate to kind of save her career, if you will, citing a wrongful suspension and asking for $40,000 to help this. I guess I want to start, Jimmy. We've went through a lot of USADA issues. I mean, you think back to Diaz right before MSG. You think about John Jones and the picogram thing. I feel like this hasn't went very smoothly for the UFC and USADA's kind of joint venture into drug testing.
You could definitely say that. It hasn't been the smoothest adventure, and this is just another example of the inconsistency of the whole process. I think that's what bothers everybody. It isn't the penalties, and it's the inconsistency of how this system has worked and not worked. That bugs just about everybody.
Yes, no, I agree completely. The needle movers, if you will, no pun intended, getting...
Hey, hear what I did
Yeah.
there? Great stuff.
I'll be at the Chuckle
Good
Hut all
timing
week.
on that one.
Yeah, the star power, then maybe perhaps a better term before I Paul Daly myself here, tends to get a little bit more leeway. It seems, just from the outside, and, you know, yes, former Invicta champion, yes, title contender, but listen, Jessica Penne is not headlining any UFC cards anytime soon, and that's no knock on her. It's just obviously we've got kind of a very evolved situation here. I mean, we go back, you know, basically what she is doing now, though, is essentially showing paperwork. It always comes down to paperwork, and the paperwork that comes out here is incredible. I mean, she basically can show you that in April 2019, her, I hate to use this word, picogram levels came from a contaminated test. She paid independent testings that proved the synthetic steroid found was contaminated in supplements that she had taken, and basically she released papers that proved it. That's not something we've really seen before, was, hey, this is a contaminated test, this is a contaminated supplement, this is not my fault, and I'm proving it to you. And she's also went off and said, I would say she went off, she's very proper with all this, but she's also came out and said, hey, and you and I both know this to be fact, the supplements that she was taking, at least some of them were provided at least to her at the UFC Performance Institute. Whether or not she took them or threw them in the trash or used them in conjunction with whatever else there was is really yet to be seen. So it's a lot of he said, she said to a degree, but at the end of the day, this is the girl's career on the line.
And that's the part that we overlook a little bit. When you say John Jones fought this test or so-and-so fought this test, a big name fights a test, you don't realize what goes into it, right? John Jones, 30 grand, 40 grand for some attorneys. You'd find that in the cushions of his couch, probably. All right. You don't see the cost of doing this. Mid-level, low-level fighters cannot go toe-to-toe with USADA. They can't afford it. And that disparity, the fact that it's so in our face now with this whole Jessica Penne situation, she literally can't afford to do the kind of things that we've seen Nick Diaz do and all this stuff, you know, going to court, kind of lawyers sitting next to him at the Nevada State Athletic Commission hearing. That costs a lot of money. And she just can't do that. So when you say her career is on the line, she's going through what a lot of fighters have gone through, but she doesn't have the resources of the top names to pay to get help. And that's kind of in our face for maybe the first time.
Okay, but to also kind of clear up just what I had said before, I don't think we've had this situation before. She basically is showing independent tests that prove the supplement or whatever she was taking was contaminated by what they tested her for. And she's got a signed document from Paul Scott of Corva Labs that discloses this. And you would think that at some level, they could go back and say, yes, this contamination matches this amount on the test. And then I don't want to say wipe the slate clean, but at least go to her and say, okay, from a public perspective, this looks off. But you could also say behind a closed door, they could say, well, yes, this accounts for X amount of this being your system, but you had Y amount in your system. And therefore, even though it could have came from here, this, anabolic steroid or synthetic steroid or whatever it is, you had a higher level than you would traditionally see in a contaminated supplement or a contaminated test. And it's ironic to me, I had mentioned in a prior video where we talked about, people will come out and say that USADA's tests are contaminated. There was a documentary done a couple years ago where they talked about the people that go collect, the samples of these things can contaminate them too. There was actually an issue where, believe it or not, a guy was going out and testing, I think, Olympic cyclists or something, and found the urine in his home refrigerator. Like, when he was done testing, rather than go back to where he was supposed to go to, he stopped at the house to take a nap and literally left the urine in his refrigerator, where God knows what can happen to it. And granted, they're not testing for asparagus or broccoli, but it just shows that sometimes these testing methods that we think are so scientific and true and clean aren't always. And to that point, I just want to go back and to where you were before. I look at Chael Sonnen and how he approached his drug test failures and kind of hold him to the gold standard of this, which we've also really not seen from anyone, where it's, I did it, where's my punishment, let me move on.
Yeah. And, there are kind of two schools of thought here. And we talked about this with, TJ Dillashaw, that the guy came clean. He didn't have much of a choice but to come clean. TJ Dillashaw got caught with a steroid or EPO, it's not a steroid, but a performance enhancing drug that is injectable. You can't find it in supplements. Don't take it orally. He got busted in a way that he had no choice but to come clean. Chael Sonnen, too, in a sense, how much do you go, oh, wow, this person's really honest. How great. Well, they did something dishonest and were honest about it. You can only give them so much credit for coming clean while doing something wrong. I guess it's better than lying and wasting everybody's time. I get that. But they're not heroes. They're coming clean about something they did wrong. Which is okay, fine. And when it comes to Jessica Penne, I mean, whether it's guilt or innocence and whether she doped or didn't, it's the ups and downs of a process that doesn't seem to have any strict coordination. We see different results and different penalties for the same thing all the time. And that's the frustrating part as a fan.
Yeah, it definitely has some lacking of balance. When we go back to her first suspension, which was out of competition in 2017, she actually got her sentence reduced from 24 months down to 18 for cooperating with the investigation and citing she was taking antibiotic steroid at that point under doctor's supervision, which again, we go back to those, gray area disclosures and who's providing them and what they're being provided for. So as fans, we're not really given a lot of transparency with this unless you get in a situation like this where the fighter has to come out, defend themselves. In this case, as we both said, basically spends her life savings and then has to turn to the fans for help trying to, clear her name. So I guess the other side of that is, do you not feel at some point you just accept this, know that USADA doesn't govern every single fighting, organization, and just maybe try to move on with your career elsewhere?
That might be all you can do. That's really, that might be the long and short of it. If she doesn't raise the money to fight, if the UFC doesn't, as a PR issue, try and get this resolved, and, who knows how much they can really do. If it's a USADA thing, the whole point is a separation of powers there. Yeah, she might have to do that. And that's incredibly unfortunate considering, the magnitude of what happened to her, and that's where she wants to fight, and that pays her the most money, and she has to step away from that. That sucks. At this point in her career, that's awful. It's a terrible feeling to have, and I've dealt with it, and you could say I'm still dealing with it, but it sucks to try and remake something at this point, especially because of something that was out of her control and out of her power.
I mean, the current suspension's 4 years. Based on her age, with all due respect, I'm pretty sure you could look at that's a retirement. Basically, and she's said that in less words. So it is her livelihood. It is how she makes her money. As you mentioned, because of just the stature of the UFC, it is going to be her most dependable paycheck, if you will, from that standpoint. How much do you think this has to be shuffled around behind closed doors before, as the public, as fans, we start to see this paperwork. Wouldn't you think that they would have exhausted themselves internally trying to fight this before they go out to us and say, hey, here's proof that we haven't done this, and here's help that we need, and we've got in this case, a financial amount associated to it?
Yeah. I mean, you want to take care of as much as you can behind closed doors, especially with the beating that USADA has taken over the last few months with, the Nate Diaz situation and the John Jones situation. It's been rough for the UFC USADA connection. And you'd want to take care of something like this for, let's face it, a mid-level fighter that, you don't want to create a huge problem over something like this. That for what? For what? Nothing. You're just making yourself look bad. You don't want the PR issue of her raising money at a GoFundMe, with a GoFundMe, from fans to fight what they consider, obviously, an unjust ruling by USADA. If she makes the money, if she raises the money, what does that say? Fans are on her side. Don't want to fight the fans if you can avoid it. So it's a lot of trouble for USADA and the UFC, and it sucks.
That's an interesting point that you make. When you go out to the fans, you bring that emotional investment, right? If you have $100, $150, $10, whatever you are going to give to her, you could obviously make a connection that you're doing that because you feel like that's the right thing to do. I'm going to help her from being wronged by donating her my money or my time or whatever I was going to do. At that point, if she still loses, then now you as a fan are kind of taking some of that defeat along with you, whereas before, this would never even enter your mindset. I mean, we look back at this stuff. I mean, I'm sorry, we look at it so passively. We can't relate to it. I can't relate to John Jones' picogram failing drug tests. I can't relate to Jessica Penne's picogram failing drug test or a second drug test suspension. Yet now we're being put in this position where this is pushed in our face, and we feel like, hey, somebody is being forced to retire from a sport that they don't want to retire from. They're put in a position where they can't compete when they want to, and the whole time they're feeling they're being wronged. While, as you said, we're kind of seeing cash cows. I don't want to say get away with it because every situation is unique and different and independent, but it seems like we find a way around things differently when there's a headlining card at Madison Square Garden, or you need to move a fight from Las Vegas on the way.
Exactly. And the injustice we're seeing here as fans is when Nate Diaz had this problem, it was cleaned up in, a day and a half? Done. Why? Because there were millions of dollars on the line and a shot at the BMF belt, Madison Square Garden, huge fight. Gears got rolling pretty quickly, didn't they? When John Jones had a picogram issue, they moved a fight for him. The gears moved pretty quickly. Jessica Penne, no one's making angry phone calls. And we're seeing how any system essentially grinds up people who don't have the resources to fight. And what you're talking about is fan investment. Fans getting invested in Jessica Penne. Hey, this is an injustice. I'm going to give $20. I'm going to give $30. Now her fate is something I am invested in. You want fan investment as the UFC, but what you don't want are fans invested in somebody who's going head to head with the UFC and this injustice, in a sense, being highlighted. That's bad press.
No, I agree completely. You never want to give fans a more viable reason to be against you, and you never want the fans to feel like, whether it's their favorite athlete or not. I mean, granted, I'm sure Jessica Penne has her fan base, but I'm sure this is attracting a lot of people to her story that otherwise may not have followed her career, may not have cared as much. But now, we're still in a position with UFC, especially kind of like you said, those mid-tier, lower-tier fighters where they've got a blue-collarness to them, where you feel like, hey, you see what they make. We see what their salaries are. It's a little bit more relatable, than a $100,000 NFL practice squad is. And, in this case, when you hear somebody literally say the quote, broke, defeated, and heartbroken, I don't care what the situation is. That's something that you don't want someone to go through if you genuinely feel like they've been wronged. And as of right now, the paperwork she's put out is pretty compelling to the side of she's been wrong. Now, to that point, USADA came out and said, hey, We've got our own, counter argument to a degree. We can make our point too. How that's going to go publicly, seeing these two go back and forth, that's a bit rough. I don't even know, honestly, talking about it, if I like knowing this is going to be a public back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to see that. You don't. You don't. If you're the UFC, if you're USADA, if you're Jessica Penne, this doesn't work out for anybody. It doesn't work out for anyone at all. And that relatability, which is so interesting, that relatability of fans to fighter, that's what the UFC wants. They want you to care. They want you to feel, Colby Covington said it. He goes, I want fans to feel emotions at fights. They hate me, want to throw stuff at me, fine. But you don't want to go to a fight and not feel anything emotionally. You want to get behind that person. And WWE, I mean, for years, Dusty Rhodes was the American dream. It was the hardworking, blue-collar guy against the flashy Ric Flair. And that contrast made people care and got people invested. So in a sense, it's kind of that the fan investment you really want as a promotion kind of working against them in this sense, because people are going to be invested in Jessica Penne if they back her in this fight against USADA.
The final point I want to bring to you regarding this is we obviously just came out of a kind of a UFC lull. Do you feel like this was the most opportune time for her to bring this up? Do you feel like, knowing that we're just, a couple weeks, well, less than a week, a couple days really away from the press conference with McGregor and Cowboy, the event, that this was going to bring people to media outlets, maybe that generally weren't there originally? They see this, and now maybe you put a little pressure on USADA or the UFC to clear this up. We're not looking for, her reinstatement. I'm looking for the right thing to be done, whether that's keeping her or not keeping her. But do you feel like that puts pressure one way against the other in terms of bringing this up now, knowing there's more eyes seeing this story?
Yes. She couldn't have picked a better time to essentially pick this fight or make this announcement. This is the best time to do it. Right before a big fight, right before a fight that's going to draw a lot of casual eyes. It's Conor McGregor. I mean, it's the best time to do it. Right after the holidays, there's a little bit of a news vacuum. Great time to do it.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen other fighters fight this battle, and it's ended relatively swiftly, or kind of, I don't want to say they went out with a whimper, but like you said, it's either everything's fine and they're still fighting, or take a look at Josh Barnett if you want another example of how things go the other way. It's going to be really interesting, though, to see how this plays out, and obviously as things kind of fluidly unravel with this, hopefully we will be back to discuss how things continue to progress for either party, whether Jessica or USADA is on the more right end of the spectrum. With that said, we appreciate you guys checking this out, and we will be back very shortly with more commentary.